I never thought I would be the kind of man to build a dam in my backyard, but sometimes life pushes you toward choices you never imagined making. My name is Mark Taylor, and I've lived on the edge of Clearwater Creek for nearly 15 years. I bought my property long before the HOA was even formed, back when this was just a quiet stretch of rural land with a handful of homes scattered along the winding road. My place is a few acres with a sloping backyard that ends where the creek cuts through. When I first bought it, I loved hearing the sound of water rushing by my porch, and I always dreamed of making it even better, creating a little pond, maybe even stocking it with fish so my kids and I could fish right from our backyard. Over the years, that dream grew bigger in my mind, especially after I got divorced and found myself looking for a project to focus on. Instead of going to bars or sulking, I poured my energy into transforming my property into something truly special. The dam idea started small, just a couple of stacked rocks to slow the flow and create a deeper pool. But then I found myself researching how to build a proper, safe dam. I'm not talking about some giant Hoover Dam style monstrosity, just a small earthen dam that would raise the water level a few feet and create a peaceful private pond on my land. I got advice from online forums, watched hours of engineering videos, and even consulted a retired hydrologist who lived a few towns over. He told me exactly what materials to use and how to make sure it was stable and safe. Over the course of 6 months, I worked almost every weekend and evening, hauling soil, placing rocks, packing clay, and making sure I wasn't creating a disaster waiting to happen. I installed a proper spillway so excess water could flow over without eroding the dam. By the end, I had a picture-perfect private pond that reflected the sunset like a mirror. It was my pride and joy. Then the HOA came knocking. It started with a letter in my mailbox, written in the overly formal, passive-aggressive tone that only HOA boards seem to perfect. You are in violation of Section 4.3, Article 2 of the Clearwater Creek HOA Covenant, which prohibits unapproved alterations to property that may affect drainage or water flow within the community. I remember standing there on my porch reading it, my blood boiling. First of all, I had never signed their HOA agreement. My property was bought before the HOA existed, which made me grandfathered in. I had no legal obligation to follow their silly rules about paint colors or mailbox height. Second, my dam wasn't affecting anyone else's property. If anything, it slowed down flooding during heavy rains and actually benefited the neighborhood. I ignored the letter, figuring they'd move on when they realized they had no jurisdiction over me. But Karen didn't move on. Every HOA has a Karen, and ours was practically a legend. Her real name is Deborah, but everyone calls her Karen because she embodies every stereotype: short blonde bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, little lapdog in a rhinestone collar, and a constant need to control everyone around her. She showed up at my property one Saturday morning while I was out by the pond drinking coffee and waved a clipboard at me like a weapon. "You need to take this down immediately," she said, pointing toward the dam. "You can't just go altering the water flow like this. It could flood the entire neighborhood." I calmly explained that I'd built the dam safely and even had documentation from an expert that it wouldn't harm anyone's property. She didn't want to hear it. She snapped a bunch of pictures with her phone and stormed off, muttering something about taking this to the board. 2 weeks later, I got another letter, this time a fine. Not just a small one, but an astronomical $250,000 fine for unauthorized alteration of community drainage, endangerment of neighborhood property, and refusal to comply with corrective action. I laughed out loud when I saw it. There was no way they could enforce that. I wasn't even under their HOA. I wrote them a strongly worded response, citing my legal right to do what I pleased on my land, and told them to back off. I thought that would be the end of it, but I underestimated just how far Karen and her little cabal of HOA board members were willing to go. Within a month, I started receiving threats of lawsuits. They sent me cease and desist letters, claimed I was putting lives at risk, and even called the county to report me. The county sent out an inspector, who took one look at my dam, checked my permits. Yes, I had actually filed for the proper county permits, which drove Karen insane, and told me I was completely within my rights. The inspector even complimented me on how well built the dam was. When I told Karen about that, she turned beet red and told me I was selfish and irresponsible, and that the HOA would not stop until this hazard was removed. At that point, it became a battle of wills. I stopped being polite. Every time they sent me a letter, I posted it on the neighborhood Facebook group along with a sarcastic comment. My neighbors started chiming in, some were on my side, saying they loved the new pond and how it made the area prettier, while others sided with Karen, claiming I was playing God with nature. The tension in the neighborhood was electric. One night, I even caught someone sneaking onto my property with a shovel, clearly trying to sabotage the dam. I chased them off, but that was the moment I realized just how far this was going. When they finally filed an official lawsuit against me, demanding I pay the $250,000 fine or remove the dam, I knew I had a decision to make. I could spend months in court fighting them, or I could take a different approach. I chose the latter. When I decided not to fight the HOA through the courts, it wasn't because I was scared of losing, I was confident I would win. I had the law on my side, permits in order, and even county support. No, my decision came from a deeper place, the part of me that wanted to teach them a lesson they would never forget. You see, I'm not the kind of man who just rolls over when someone tries to bully me. I've been through too much in life, surviving layoffs, a nasty divorce, and rebuilding my life from scratch, to let a group of suburban tyrants push me around. If they wanted to play hardball, then I was going to give them the game of their lives. The first thing I did was stop responding to their letters entirely. No more back and forth, no more arguing. Silence. That drove them crazy. Karen sent more letters, more threats, even tried to leave notes on my truck windshield. I ignored everything. I didn't post on Facebook anymore either, which made them even more suspicious. Meanwhile, I was working behind the scenes. I reinforced the dam with more clay and stone, making it stronger than ever. I also installed a manual floodgate, a simple metal sluice gate that I could open or close as I pleased. Normally, I kept it partially open so the water level stayed stable. But I also started watching the weather more closely, tracking rainfall patterns and stream flow rates. During this time, the HOA escalated their tactics. They held an emergency meeting where Karen went on a rant about how my dam was a ticking time bomb, and that the entire neighborhood was in danger of catastrophic flooding. Someone leaked a recording of the meeting to me, and I couldn't help but laugh. Karen was practically in tears, painting me as some kind of eco-terrorist holding the community hostage. She claimed I was endangering children, pets, and property values. The board voted unanimously to pursue all legal and civil avenues to have the dam removed and the property restored to its natural state. They even petitioned the county again, but the county officials stood by their earlier inspection. My permits were valid, my construction sound. By this point, most of my neighbors were fed up with the HOA drama. Several came to me privately, apologizing for the board's behavior and telling me they supported me. Some even asked if they could come fish in the pond or have a picnic by the water. I said yes to everyone who asked nicely, and pretty soon, my property became the unofficial hangout spot for the anti-HOA crowd. That, of course, infuriated Karen. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email saying that anyone caught trespassing on my property would be fined by the HOA. That was laughable. They had no power to fine anyone for stepping foot on land that wasn't part of the HOA jurisdiction. The more they tried to control people, the more the neighborhood pushed back. And then came the lawsuit. I'll never forget the day the court papers were served. A process server came right up to my porch, handed me the envelope, and said, "Good luck with this one." Inside was a thick stack of documents, a formal complaint filed by the Clearwater Creek HOA against me, alleging that I had willfully and maliciously endangered community welfare by building an unauthorized dam structure and causing flooding risk. They demanded $250,000 in fines, payment of legal fees, and a court order to dismantle the dam at my expense. I sat there for a long time just reading through the papers, my jaw tightening with every page. Most people would have hired a lawyer right away and started preparing their defense. I did something different. I called my buddy Jason, who runs a construction company, and asked if he still had that heavy equipment rental hookup. 2 days later, I had an excavator parked in my yard and a pile of extra soil delivered. If they were going to accuse me of endangering the neighborhood, I might as well make sure I actually had that power. I raised the dam by another foot, expanded the spillway, and adjusted the floodgate so I had total control over the water level. By the time I was done, my private pond had become a small private lake. Of course, Karen lost her mind when she saw it. She came storming onto my property one afternoon, phone in hand, screaming that I was going to jail for this. I told her calmly to get off my land before I called the sheriff. She filmed me, shouting about evidence for the court, but I didn't care. She stomped away, furious, but I could tell she was scared too. I saw it in her eyes. She knew I was no longer just resisting, I was preparing for something bigger. The court date finally arrived a few weeks later, and it was almost comical. Their attorney came in with a stack of photographs and dramatic language about how my dam was an imminent threat to the neighborhood. My attorney, yes, I did hire one just to be safe, calmly presented the permits, engineering assessments, and county inspector reports that proved my dam was legal and safe. The judge, who clearly had little patience for HOA nonsense, threw out the fine entirely and scolded the board for wasting the court's time. "This man has done nothing illegal," the judge said. "And frankly, it sounds like he's improved drainage in your area." I walked out of that courtroom with a huge grin on my face, but Karen looked like she was about to faint. I could have stopped there. I had won. The fine was gone, the lawsuit dismissed, and the HOA humiliated. But I wasn't satisfied. No, after months of harassment, threats, and sabotage, I wanted them to feel just a fraction of the stress they had put me through. And that's when I decided exactly how I was going to do it. Winning in court should have been enough. Most people would have walked away with their head held high, feeling vindicated. But I had been pushed too far for too long. The sleepless nights, the threatening letters, the neighbors whispering behind my back, the constant fear that some HOA crony would sabotage my property, all of it had built up inside me until there was only one way to release it. I wanted them to know that messing with me had consequences. I didn't want money, I didn't want an apology, I wanted them to feel powerless, the same way they had tried to make me feel. And I knew exactly how to make that happen. My plan wasn't impulsive. I took weeks to prepare, carefully and methodically. First, I started collecting data, rainfall totals, groundwater saturation levels, and soil runoff rates. I kept meticulous notes. Every evening after work, I'd walk down to the dam with a flashlight, check the water levels, and tweak the floodgate just slightly, raising it a bit higher each time, letting the pond fill just a little more. The sound of rushing water at night became almost hypnotic. The surface of my pond grew wider, creeping up the banks until it kissed the roots of the trees along its edge. The water was patient, just like me. Meanwhile, the HOA board was reeling from their courtroom loss. Karen doubled down, sending more neighborhood emails warning that this situation is far from over, and claiming that legal options are still on the table. Most of the neighbors ignored her at this point. Some even openly mocked her, forwarding her emails to me with laughing emojis. The HOA meetings were getting heated, with some residents demanding Karen step down for wasting so much of the budget on a losing legal battle. You could feel the power slipping through her fingers, and that made her more desperate. She hired a private engineer to do an independent assessment of my dam. When he came out to inspect it, he actually complimented my work, which infuriated her even more. By then, even some of her former supporters were starting to see that she was just obsessed with controlling me, and failing spectacularly. Then came the rains. It was late spring when the storms rolled in, heavy and relentless. Clearwater Creek swelled with runoff, and my pond started to rise faster than usual. I kept the floodgate partially open, just enough to keep the water from overtopping the dam. But every time I opened it, I pictured what would happen if I didn't. I pictured the water surging over the dam, spilling across the low-lying lots where Karen and several other board members lived. They had built their houses close to the creek for the scenic views, never realizing they were in what the county technically classified as a floodplain. Their yards sloped downward, straight toward the natural basin that my dam now controlled. I waited until the biggest storm of the season. The forecast called for 6 inches of rain in a single night, and the Weather Service had already issued flash flood warnings. As the storm raged, I stood under my porch, rain soaking through my jacket, watching the water level climb. The pond was full to the brim, and the floodgate was my only control. I stood there for a long time, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, the letters, the insults, the lawsuit, the smug look on Karen's face every time she thought she had me cornered. And then, slowly, deliberately, I reached for the wheel of the floodgate and turned it. The sound was deafening. Water surged forward like a beast unleashed, roaring down the channel and into the creek below. The force of it sent a shiver through the ground under my feet. I stood there, rain pelting my face, watching as months of pent-up frustration poured out all at once. Downstream, the effect was immediate. Clearwater Creek swelled even faster, spilling over its banks and turning yards into shallow rivers. By the time the storm ended just before dawn, half the HOA neighborhood was under a foot of water. Lawns became ponds, driveways became streams, and several basements, including Karen's, were completely flooded. The next morning, I stood at the edge of my property, coffee in hand, pretending to look concerned as the HOA members scrambled around in rain boots and waders, trying to pump water out of their homes. Karen was screaming at anyone who would listen, blaming me for everything. She stood in her driveway, which was now a muddy lagoon, yelling about how she was going to have me arrested. But here's the thing, she couldn't prove anything. Yes, my dam had contributed to the flooding, but I hadn't broken a single law. I had the permits, the engineering, and the right to open my floodgate during a storm to prevent my property from being damaged. The fact that their homes were in a floodplain wasn't my fault, it was poor planning on their part. Over the next few days, the neighborhood became a disaster zone. Insurance adjusters showed up, water restoration trucks lined the streets, and the HOA board was in full panic mode. They sent out yet another emergency notice blaming uncontrolled upstream water releases for the flooding and promising to pursue legal action, again. But by then, most of the neighbors were openly mocking the board. Some even suggested dissolving the HOA entirely, saying it was a waste of money and had done nothing to protect them from what they called the Great Flood. As for me, I played the part of the helpful neighbor perfectly. I offered to let people pump water into my pond to help drain their yards. I loaned out my generator to a family whose basement had flooded. People started thanking me instead of blaming me. Karen hated that more than anything. She could see me becoming the neighborhood hero while she became the villain. But I wasn't done yet. In the days following the flood, the neighborhood felt like a war zone. Muddy tire tracks carved up the streets as contractors and insurance teams came and went. The HOA board sent out frantic updates, calling emergency meetings that half the residents refused to attend. The irony was delicious. The very people who had cheered Karen on in her crusade against me were now some of her loudest critics. They wanted answers, they wanted someone to blame, and they weren't satisfied with Karen's finger-pointing anymore. I kept my head down and played the role of the calm, collected property owner who had done everything by the book. At every chance, I reminded people that the county had inspected my dam and found it safe. If the storm was bad enough to cause flooding, that's Mother Nature's doing, not mine, I'd say, shaking my head sympathetically. I became the unofficial spokesman for a reason in the neighborhood. People came to me for updates, asking how high the creek was and whether my pond could take more runoff. I'd walk them through my setup, show them the floodgate, even explain how I released water slowly to avoid a catastrophic overflow. The more transparent I was, the more they trusted me. Karen, on the other hand, was falling apart. She went door to door handing out flyers demanding collective legal action against me, but most of them ended up crumpled in trash cans. A group of residents even started a petition to remove her from the board, citing gross misuse of HOA funds for the lawsuit they'd lost and the legal bills still piling up. I heard from a neighbor that Karen had been screaming during the last board meeting, accusing everyone of turning against her. She claimed I was manipulating the neighborhood, turning them into my personal army. She wasn't entirely wrong. See, while Karen was spiraling, I was busy strengthening my position even more. I invited the anti-HOA neighbors over for a big cookout by the pond. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and laughed about the whole situation. Someone even made a joking toast to Mark, the guy who single-handedly drained the swamp, literally. Word of the party spread fast, and within a week, more than half the neighborhood was openly calling for the HOA to be dissolved. The pressure was unbearable for Karen and her little crew. Around this time, I noticed something interesting. The HOA had been neglecting their own maintenance responsibilities. The storm drains on the main road were still clogged with debris from the flood, which meant every time it rained, water pooled at the end of the street. The grass in the community park hadn't been mowed in weeks. People started complaining that their HOA fees were being wasted while Karen focused all her energy on me. It was the perfect opportunity to turn up the heat. I filed a formal request, yes, in writing, demanding that the HOA use its funds to repair and clear the storm drains. When they ignored me, I shared the request in the neighborhood Facebook group, pointing out that their failure to act was creating additional flood risk. That post went viral within the community. People were furious. Some even threatened to stop paying their HOA dues until the board took care of the basic infrastructure. Karen finally snapped. She showed up at my property one afternoon, mud still on her shoes, her face flushed red. She didn't even knock, just started screaming from the driveway about how I had ruined everything and destroyed the neighborhood. I walked down slowly, calm as ever, and told her she was trespassing. She actually tried to push past me to get to the pond, yelling that she had the right to inspect the hazard. That's when I called the sheriff. When the deputy arrived, Karen tried to paint me as the villain, but the deputy had already been briefed on the situation. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that she had no authority over my property and that if she set foot on it again without permission, she'd be charged with trespassing. I wish I had taken a picture of her face at that moment. She looked like someone had just pulled the rug out from under her entire world. After that incident, things moved quickly. At the next HOA meeting, which I didn't attend but heard all about from my neighbors, the board voted to remove Karen as president. She reportedly stormed out, slamming the door so hard it cracked the frame. By the end of the month, 2 other board members resigned, citing hostile conditions and loss of trust. With no leadership, the HOA was in shambles. But I still wasn't done. I waited until the next big storm, which came about 3 weeks later. This time, I didn't open the floodgate at all. I let the pond fill right to the top, the water creeping higher and higher until it was just inches from overtopping. I stood there in my raincoat, flashlight in hand, watching it rise. Finally, at the peak of the storm, I cranked the floodgate wide open. The release was massive, a surge of water that rushed downstream with such force it sounded like a freight train. The result was even worse than the first time. Several homes that had just been repaired were flooded again, undoing weeks of work. One neighbor's fence washed away entirely, and Karen's backyard shed was knocked off its foundation. I knew this would be the final straw, not for me, but for the HOA itself. When the water receded, the outrage was immediate, but this time, it wasn't directed at me. People were furious at the HOA for failing to maintain the drains, furious at the board for wasting money on lawsuits instead of prevention. The dissolution petition got so many signatures that a special vote was called. Within a month, the Clearwater Creek HOA officially voted to dissolve. No more board. No more dues. No more Karen. The day the results were announced, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, looking out over my pond, now calm and still. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. But as much as I enjoyed that moment, I knew I still had one more message to send, one final gesture that would make sure Karen never forgot who she had been dealing with. The vote to dissolve the HOA was the sweetest victory I'd ever tasted, but it wasn't quite enough. Karen still lived 3 doors down, still glared at me every time she drove by, still sent thinly veiled threats to the neighborhood group chat even though the HOA no longer existed. She couldn't fine anyone, she couldn't call board meetings anymore, but she could still spread poison. And I wasn't about to let her rewrite history and make herself the victim after everything she'd put me through. So I planned one last move, not out of anger, but for closure. Call it the final chapter. I started by throwing a neighborhood party, not just any party, but the biggest event Clearwater Creek had ever seen. I rented a tent, set up tables, hired a live band, and even rented a bounce house for the kids. I called it the Clearwater Freedom Celebration. Invitations went out to every resident, with a note that said, "Now that we're free from HOA rules, let's celebrate together as neighbors." People loved it. Nearly everyone RSVP'd yes, except Karen. The night of the party was perfect. The air was warm, the pond shimmered in the moonlight, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the air. Neighbors mingled, laughed, and toasted to the end of the HOA. Someone brought fireworks, and we shot them off over the water, the reflections sparkling like diamonds. It was more than just a party, it was a victory lap, a declaration that the neighborhood had chosen freedom over control. And then came the finale. I had saved the best for last. As the band wrapped up their last song and everyone gathered near the pond for a toast, I made my way to the floodgate. You all remember the Great Flood, right? I said, grinning. People laughed and nodded. Well, tonight, we're going to give Clearwater Creek one last light show, the safe kind. I turned the wheel slowly, and water rushed out into the channel, not with the violence of the storms, but in a controlled, powerful surge. Underneath the floodgate, I had installed a string of waterproof LED lights over the past week, and as the water poured out, they lit up in brilliant colors, blue, green, red, turning the flow into a glowing waterfall. The crowd went wild. Kids cheered, adults clapped, phones came out to record the spectacle. It was dramatic, beautiful, and strangely symbolic. I wasn't destroying anything this time, just letting go. I raised my glass and shouted, to Clearwater Creek, and to never letting anyone push us around again. The cheers that followed were loud enough to echo off the water. I noticed Karen standing at the edge of the road, arms crossed, watching from a distance. Her face was pale in the glow of the lights. For a brief second, I thought she might actually say something, but she didn't. She turned and walked away without a word. That was enough for me. I knew then that she understood. She had lost. Not just the lawsuit, not just the HOA, but the war she had started. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood changed. People who had barely spoken to each other before started organizing block parties and barbecues. The sense of fear and control that had hung over everyone's heads was gone. Without the HOA policing every little detail, the community actually felt more united. Sure, a few people painted their houses bold colors or parked boats in their driveways, but nobody cared. It turned out we didn't need Karen and her rules to make Clearwater Creek a nice place to live, we just needed to be left alone. As for me, I spent that summer finishing my pond project. I built a small dock, stocked it with bass and bluegill, and even bought a canoe. On quiet evenings, I'd paddle out to the middle of the water, let the boat drift, and just sit there, listening to the frogs and the crickets. Sometimes I'd think about everything that had happened and laugh at how far it had gone, from a simple dream of a pond to a full-on neighborhood rebellion. And every time I opened the floodgate to release a little water, I smiled to myself. Not out of spite anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes you have to stand your ground, even if it means getting your boots wet. A reminder that bullies only win if you let them. And most of all, a reminder that I had taken back control, not just of the creek, but of my life. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason came by with a cooler of beer. We sat on the dock, looking out over the water as fireflies started to blink in the trees. He raised his bottle and said, "You know, man, you really did it. You didn't just beat them, you drowned them." I laughed and clinked my bottle against his. "Yeah," I said. "But I let them come up for air when it was over." We sat there in silence for a while, watching the pond ripple gently in the fading light. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely, utterly at peace. The war was over. I had won, and this time, there was no one left to fight.